The momentous events of the morning of the 7th of December 1941 were to have a profound effect on the eventual outcome of World War II. It was then, on what President Roosevelt called a day of infamy, that a huge force of Japanese aircraft attacked the unsuspecting US Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. During the devastating raid, 19 US ships were sunk and more than 2,000 US lives were lost. The die was cast. The United States was soon firmly in the war, and Japan had taken the first steps on the road that would ultimately lead to the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
In infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The origins of one of the most infamous episodes in military history can be traced back as far as the year 1905 and the unexpected Japanese naval victory over the Russians at Tsushima. The triumph there provided the Japanese with the encouragement they needed to accelerate the pace of the naval expansion that had begun almost 50 years earlier. Japan continued to build her navy until 1922, when the Washington Conference Treaty, signed by the United States, Great Britain, and Japan, fixed the tonnage of capital ships and placed restrictions on warship construction by all three of these major naval powers. By the end of the 1930s, however, Japan was in the grip of fervent nationalism, and the world watched as political turmoil at home turned into outright aggression abroad. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria, an act carried out in defiance of the Japanese government by the all-powerful military, and which directly threatened the open-door policy of the United States towards China and its huge commercial markets. The US response, though, was weak, and emboldened by its success, Japan sought naval parity with the US at the 1934 London Naval Conference. When this was refused, she withdrew, abrogating all existing agreements and treaties, and within the year, the pace of Japanese shipbuilding had increased to such an extent that her navy posed a considerable threat to the mighty US fleet in the Pacific. While Japan eyed the riches of Eastern Asia, the USA continued to look inwards. The Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, and 37 were passed by Congress in an attempt to keep the US out of any European war, reflecting the isolationist mood in the US at the time. The country received a jolt, however, when, in 1937, the Japanese further extended their Chinese interests by seizing Inner Mongolia and northern China. Perhaps the American people, who were largely sympathetic to the Chinese, expected something more than Roosevelt's famous conciliatory quarantine speech in October that year. Still, Japan persisted with her Chinese adventure, and by 1938 she controlled vast areas of the north and the center of that country. Not only this, but the methods of the Japanese army, which included the shelling of civilians, reached levels of savagery previously unseen. As a consequence, the public mood in the US turned from sympathy to outrage. But the pleas of the government for US manufacturers to place a moral embargo on Japan were hardly likely to halt the naked Japanese aggression. To add to US woes, the crisis in Europe also came to further help the Japanese in their territorial ambitions. In March 1939, Adolf Hitler's armies marched into Prague. As they did so, Japan invaded the island of Hainan. In 1940, the fall of France to the rampant Germans gave the Japanese an opportunity to march into French Indochina with the compliance of the Vichy government. Finally, the British were forced to close the Burma Road trade route to China in the same year. Events in both Japan and the USA were now moving as swiftly as those abroad. In July 1941, the USA placed a full trade embargo on Japan and froze her assets at home. In October 1941, Prince Konoe's largely moderate government fell, to be replaced by a new regime headed by the hawkish General Tojo. While in the USA, as the prospect of war loomed ever closer, Roosevelt wrestled with the twin problems of diplomatic necessity and military expediency. A final, unsuccessful attempt at mediation was made on November 20th, 1941, a mere 6 weeks before the Pearl Harbor attack. War was now inevitable. The Japanese foreign minister even warned his ambassador in Washington that unless agreement could be reached before November 29th, things were going to happen. In the USA, the reluctant American cabinet was still preoccupied with diplomatic procedure as it searched for a way to force Japan into opening hostilities without inflicting casualties or damage on US armed forces. Meanwhile, the American military was receiving decoded messages from the South Pacific that tragically it appeared to deem unimportant. Those messages carried warnings that the Japanese Air Force planned to strike first at the US naval base in Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was Japan's greatest naval strategist and the man who planned the raid on Pearl Harbor. Not only was he a vastly experienced naval officer who had fought against the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, but he had also spent time in the USA, firstly as a language student at Harvard University, and later as assistant naval attaché in Washington. His time in the US had imbued him with a healthy respect for the country that was now Japan's enemy, for he had seen at first hand America's enormous industrial manufacturing capabilities. Perhaps it was this that prompted the pragmatic Yamamoto to warn his countrymen during the early months of the war, "We can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have utterly no confidence." In 1940, Yamamoto was given command of the flagship Nagato and overall command of the Japanese combined fleet. Nagumo was in command of the first air fleet, known as Kido Butai, and directed operations from the carrier Akagi. Nagumo had only a limited experience of carrier-borne warfare and was also a very cautious man. This combination persuaded him not to send in a third wave of attack aircraft at Pearl Harbor. Many military historians have concluded that Nagumo's caution may have saved the US Pacific Fleet from total destruction. Genda held the post of First Staff Officer, 1st Air Fleet, for the Pearl Harbor attack. Like Yamamoto, he too had lived and worked abroad, this time in London, where he had closely studied the Royal Navy's tactics and weaponry. Genda was deeply involved in planning the Pearl Harbor attack, even designing new types of torpedoes that were used during the raid. The confident Genda argued that the air attack should be supported by an amphibious landing, a proposal that was rejected by Japanese High Command. A hugely experienced combat pilot, with more than 3,000 flying hours to his credit, Fushida led the devastating first attack wave at Pearl Harbor. He too had been closely involved with the overall battle plan, drawing up strategy and tactics with his good friend Genda. Hard-working and capable, Fushida had also been responsible for pilot training prior to the attack. The commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack was the highly experienced Rear Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, who had been given command of the base in the early part of 1941. Kimmel had certainly been unhappy with the state of the defences at Pearl Harbor, and had instigated a rigorous improvement and training program, although he was constrained by poor supply and equipment. What was more, the U.S. Atlantic Fleet had been the focus of attention by U.S. High Command during 1940 and 1941. Throughout November, Kimmel had received warnings from Washington, including one on November the 27th, which read, "Consider this note a war warning." Unfortunately, the messages indicated that the principal threat to the base came from sabotage, and its defences were organised accordingly. Lieutenant General Walter C. Short commanded the Army forces at Pearl Harbor. A noted disciplinarian, with a reputation for carrying out orders to the letter, Short was also considered by his contemporaries to be unimaginative and lacking in initiative. Along with Kimmel, Short paid the price for the disaster at Pearl Harbor when he was dismissed shortly after the raid, a victim of his own short-sightedness and the general confusion which surrounded the U.S. defense preparations. As the combination of the US trade embargo and Japan's refusal to change her policy in Eastern Asia made war inevitable, Japanese military strategists went to work. The plan was to negate the need for a clash with the powerful US Navy during the crucial opening phase of the coming conflict. Yamamoto's plan for the attack on Pearl Harbor did exactly that, and the necessary training programs were quickly implemented. Echoing the past, the plan was given the code name Operation Z, the very same signal used by Admiral Tojo at Tsushima 36 years earlier. The attack was a bold gamble, but success would bring rich rewards. Pearl Harbor was one of a series of Japanese moves in early December 1941 against targets in the Pacific that included the Philippines, Midway, Guam, and Hong Kong. These targets were carefully chosen to secure the supply of raw materials so vital to the Japanese war effort. If the Japanese war preparations thus far had been energetic and vigorous, those by the US had been slow and not a little complacent. Still believing that a resolution to the crisis could be reached through diplomacy and that no military action would be taken while discussions continued, the US was simply not on the same war footing as Japan. After a decade of isolationism, no one seemed able to believe that Japan would take the enormous step towards war with the United States. Certainly, the sheer distance between the two nations gave the US some sense of security, for it was believed, not unreasonably, that if war did come, it would be impossible for Japan to send a force against a US target without being detected. Perhaps it is with the gift of hindsight that it is obvious that the Japanese were preparing to strike, that the likely target was the US Pacific Fleet, that the defensive arrangements were inadequate, and that the US was issuing an unwitting invitation to the Japanese to strike. As we have seen, the Japanese had been building their navy at a furious pace since their withdrawal from the London Naval Conference in 1934. And by the opening of hostilities in 1941, they possessed a considerable naval force. This included 8 aircraft carriers, 10 battleships, 18 heavy cruisers, 20 light cruisers, and over 100 destroyers. A further 60 ships of various classes were under construction. In addition to this, the Japanese seamen and air crews were highly motivated and trained. They knew exactly what was expected of them as they approached Pearl Harbor. This training, along with a fearlessness that came from a belief that it was an honor to die for the Emperor, made the Japanese a formidable foe. Japanese aircraft carriers played a major role in the Pearl Harbor attack. No fewer than 8 took part. They ranged in weight from just under 16,000 tons to over 38,000 tons, and carried 10, 8, and 5-inch and 25mm guns. The Japanese aircraft carriers could carry between 71 and 91 aircraft and could sail at speeds of up to 34 knots. Although the fleet always travelled at the speed of the slowest vessels, which were always the support tankers. The events at Pearl Harbor announced the aircraft carrier as a major element of the modern Navy, crucial in achieving surprise over the enemy and vital for flexibility and mobility within the fleet. No less important were the aircraft aboard the carriers that provided the cutting edge of the attack. The Aichi D3A1 was the Japanese Navy's mainstay aircraft during the early years of World War II. A purpose-built, 2-seater dive bomber, it was powered by a Mitsubishi Kinsei 44 engine whose 44 cylinders allowed a top speed of some 240 miles per hour. With a range of 1,130 miles and a ceiling height of 34,450 feet, the plane carried a 550-pound bomb under the main fuselage with 2 smaller 66-pound bombs under each wing. There were 2 7.7mm machine guns fixed in the upper part of the fuselage, forward of the cockpit. 470 Aichi D3A1 aircraft were produced during the war. Although the plane was at the forefront of the Pearl Harbor attack, it soon became obsolete. The Nakajima B5N2 was a torpedo bomber crewed by 3 men. Powered by a 9-cylinder Nakajima Sakai engine and with a top speed of 235 miles per hour, the plane had a range of 1,235 miles and had a maximum operational height of 27,100 feet. It was able to carry either a 1,764-pound torpedo or 3 551-pound bombs. Armed with a rear-facing 7.7mm machine gun, more than 1,100 Nakajima torpedo bombers were produced by Japan during the war. Perhaps the most famous of all Japanese planes of World War II, however, was the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero. "90 of these deadly fighter aircraft attacked at Pearl Harbor, 50 in the first wave and 40 in the second. Crewed by a single pilot and with a top speed of 316 miles per hour, the Zero could operate to a height of 32,800 feet, and with the use of a drop tank under the main fuselage, it could fly to a range of 1,930 miles. The Zero's two 20mm wing-mounted cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns located in the upper fuselage were complemented by the provision of an external bomb load of up to 130 pounds. 11,200 Zeros were manufactured during the war. Like that of the Japanese, the US naval fleet had been rebuilt during the late 1930s after it was scaled down in accordance with the 1922 disarmament treaty. There was little public appetite for the task as the country continued to look inwards, ignoring the growing threat to world peace from potential enemies in both the East and West. Even allowing for this reticence, the US still possessed the most powerful and formidable navy in the world. It was in 1940 that the decision was made to house the US Pacific Fleet permanently at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was not a popular posting for the men of the US Navy. Remote from the US mainland and lacking in facilities, the base soon gained a reputation for repetitious exercises and monotonous routine. In short, for boring preparation for a war that would never come. All these factors contributed to an air of complacency that would be shattered on December the 7th. The choice of Pearl Harbor for the base was in itself an acceptance by the US that Japan was now a threat to peace in the Pacific region. The move was simply too little, too late. For while the diplomats and politicians wrangled, Japan had been allowed to build a navy capable of challenging the mighty US fleet. There was in fact a radar system in use on the day of the Pearl Harbor raid, with no less than 5 early warning stations placed around the base to provide information on incoming enemy ships or planes. Indeed, the radar station at Opana clearly picked up Fushida's attack force and relayed accurate information on its size, speed, and direction. If the information had been acted upon, the outcome of the battle may have been very different. But tragically, the authorities chose to discount what the radar was clearly telling them. There were a variety of anti-aircraft weapons available for the defense of Pearl Harbor. They ranged from the .30-inch M1919 machine gun with a rate of fire of 500 rounds per minute to the Browning .5-inch M2 that could fire 575 rounds in the same time. These weapons, however, were largely ineffective against aircraft flown at high speed and altitude. The 3-inch and 5-inch anti-aircraft guns stationed at Pearl Harbor could fire 25 rounds per minute up to heights of 30,000 feet, and would have been more effective had the Japanese not achieved the vital element of surprise. One of the very few US planes to get airborne during the raid was the Curtiss P-40 fighter plane, one of the war's most capable fighter aircraft. 2,300 were sent into action during World War II, and it was the pilots of these aircraft, with their .3 and .5-inch machine guns, who laid claim to shooting down the few Japanese planes lost during the attack. The attack on Pearl Harbor was carried out by the Japanese First Air Carrier Fleet. The force was centered around 6 aircraft carriers, the largest of which was Nagumo's command ship, the Akagi. With a crew of 2,000 and with 91 aircraft on board, the Akagi weighed in at a massive 36,500 tons and was armed with 8-inch and 25mm guns. Of similar size and capabilities was the Kaga, which had been built as a battle cruiser in 1928 and was converted in a series of refits. Carrying 70 planes and 1,100 crew was the Soryu, a carrier that had been built in 1937 and followed in 1939 by the Hiryu, the 4th aircraft carrier in the fleet. These formidable ships were joined by the newest Japanese aircraft carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku. These vessels, boasting a top speed of 34 knots, carrying 84 planes each, and with crews of 1,600 men, were completed just in time for the Pearl Harbor assault. The 6 carriers of the Japanese fleet would send a total of 355 aircraft into battle on December the 7th. Supporting the great Japanese aircraft carriers were the 2 battleships, Heel and Kirishima, and 3 cruisers, the Tone, Chikuma, and Abukuma. There were also 9 destroyers, and the fleet was accompanied by 8 fuel tankers, 27 Class I submarines, and 5 midget submarines. On December the 7th, there were almost 100 ships at anchor at Pearl Harbor, but crucially, no US carriers were among them. The Saratoga was in dry dock on the US West Coast, while the Lexington and the Enterprise were away delivering planes to the US bases at Midway and Wake. These ships had been prime Japanese targets, and if their absence was a blow, there would be many other opportunities to do real damage. The battleships Nevada, Arizona, Tennessee, Maryland, West Virginia, Oklahoma, California, and Pennsylvania stood silently at anchor. With them were 29 destroyers, 4 submarines, 23 minesweepers, and an array of seaplane tenders, cargo, and repair ships. The cruisers Raleigh, Detroit, Helena, San Francisco, New Orleans, St. Louis, Honolulu, and Phoenix also beckoned for the Japanese, along with Hickam Field, Wheeler, Kaneohe, and Iwa, the 4 airfields that served the Pearl Harbor base. The attack fleet that would strike Pearl Harbor left its assembly point at Tankan Bay in the Kurile Islands to the northeast of Japan on November the 26th, 1941. Ahead lay a journey of some 3,000 miles. It was a nervous voyage, made in radio silence, that took the fleet outside the usual shipping lanes. For the Japanese knew that secrecy and surprise were absolutely vital to the success of the mission. Meanwhile, the farcical charade that passed for diplomacy continued. Even after having received instructions to destroy codes and make plans to leave Washington, and with the certain knowledge that a fleet was on its way to Pearl Harbor, Japanese diplomats kept up the pretense, although by now President Roosevelt appeared to have abandoned hopes of a peaceful solution. On December the 6th, he is reported to have said to his aides, "This means war." Roosevelt was very soon to be proved correct, for just after midnight on December the 6th, the Japanese strike force arrived at their destination, a position 230 miles north of Oahu Island from which the attack would be made. Operation Z was about to begin. Back in Washington, the U.S. Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, returned to his home from a morning bike ride at 11:30 a.m. on December the 7th. There, he found a copy of a decoded Japanese message that had been waiting for him for more than an hour. Its contents prompted Marshall to send an immediate warning to the Pearl Harbor base. The Japanese are presenting at 1 p.m. today Eastern Standard Time what amounts to an ultimatum. Also, they are under orders to destroy their code machine immediately. Just what the significance of the hour may have, we do not know, but be on the alert accordingly. Unfortunately, this handwritten message did not arrive until after the first Japanese aircraft had screamed down from the blue skies above Pearl Harbor to drop their deadly payloads. The Japanese planned to attack in two waves, one after the other. The first wave of 180 aircraft was led personally by Fushida, and his formation left the aircraft carriers at 6 a.m. on the morning of December the 7th. More than an hour before the first bombs dropped, US radar detected the onrushing Japanese force. But the watch officer decided that the blips on the screen were American aircraft approaching from the mainland. At 7:55 a.m., bombs began to smash into the US fleet, and the famous words were broadcast, "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill." The first attack lasted for about half an hour, during which Japanese planes made 4 separate bomber torpedo attacks. Their target was Battleship Row, on the southeast shore of Hawaii, where the US battleships were lined up, invitingly, next to each other. Other Zeros poured shells into the US airfields, where, in an effort to thwart possible sabotage, the US aircraft had also been lined up in neat and convenient rows. In a short time, these airbases had been totally destroyed, with enormous loss of life. The The planes attacking the battleships had been allotted particular targets, and their torpedoes soon found their mark. The battleship Arizona fared worst. The torpedoes and bombs that slammed into her turned the ship into a blazing inferno that rapidly sank beneath the waters of the harbour. With her went more than 1,000 members of her crew, who were trapped beneath decks. The Arizona was joined on the seabed by the Oklahoma and the California, and only quick counterflooding saved the West Virginia from capsizing as she too sank beneath the waves. The Tennessee, however, had been protected by the West Virginia and escaped relatively unscathed, as did the Nevada and the Maryland, which of all the battleships suffered the least damage. Elsewhere, the Raleigh, Utah, Helena, and the mine layer, Oglala, were all badly damaged or sunk. It was 8:25 a.m. before the first wave of Japanese attacks ended. After a brief lull, the second wave of 170 aircraft led by Lieutenant Commander Shimazaki arrived to continue the devastation of the base. But they were not to find life quite so comfortable as the first wave. A thick blanket of smoke from the damaged ships cloaked the harbour, obscuring vision. Furthermore, US personnel had manned anti-aircraft guns and, showing great bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, had attempted to fight back. Although 20 Japanese planes from the second wave were shot down, they still managed to do more crippling damage to US ships, including the Pennsylvania, the Shaw, the Cassin, and the Honolulu. The fighting over the harbour raged until 9:45 a.m., when at last the Japanese attackers turned for home. Returning to the fleet, the ruthless Fushida begged to make a final third attack on the base, an attack that he felt would utterly devastate the US Navy. Nagumo refused the request, arguing that the attack had achieved its objectives and that it would be foolish to risk further loss to the Japanese forces. The fleet began its triumphant journey back to Japan, and history will never know if Fushida's proposed third attack would have changed the course of World War II. The Japanese left behind them a scene of total devastation and destruction. In less than 2 hours over the target, they had sunk or severely damaged 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 8 various other ships. .280 American aircraft had also been damaged or destroyed, and many hangars and aircraft buildings had been flattened. The cost in lives to the USA was immense. 3,500 people had become casualties. Of these, 2,403 had been killed. A third of the dead had been aboard the Arizona when it exploded into a ball of fire and sank. By contrast, the Japanese lost 5 midget submarines and 29 aircraft, these from an attack force of 360 planes. There was no doubt that as a military operation, Yamamoto's attack had been a stunning success that had, in the short term at least, removed the threat to Japan posed by the US Navy. The victory had been achieved against an underprepared and complacent enemy, who had chosen to ignore the clear signs of an impending attack and had been severely punished. As the sun set on the wreckage of the USA's most infamous military failure, the Pacific region lay firmly under Japanese control. Pearl Harbor may have been a military success, but when viewed in a wider context, the entire episode was without doubt Japan's greatest mistake. The attack had been completely unnecessary. The Pacific Fleet would have been unable to stop Japan's initial advances in any case. What better way to bring America, with all its military and industrial might, into a war that it had previously tried desperately to avoid? All meaningful debate in the US about what would be achieved by going to war for the second time in 20 years was ended. The American mood of isolationism was replaced by a desire for revenge. Eventually, Japan would pay dearly for its day of glory. Even strategically, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a mere short-term success. The biggest prize, the great US aircraft carriers, had after all been out of the harbor at the time of the attack. And the fact was that many of the battleships and destroyers damaged in the attack were soon restored to the fleet. The Nevada, for example, played its part in the bombardment of Iwo Jima and sailed as part of the Allied invasion fleet at Normandy. California, Tennessee, and West Virginia all returned to haunt and harry the Japanese during the US advance in the Philippines. Perhaps Japan would have been better served by trying to destroy oil depots and command installations rather than battleships. After the attack, Hitler was persuaded by Japan to join with them in the struggle against America. This too would prove to be an enormous blunder. Although the US regarded Germany as an enemy, how would she have gained public support for a war in the West while fighting Japan in the East? Hitler made such questions unnecessary with his declaration of war on the USA, and as a consequence, the Allies were able to agree a worldwide strategy to defeat, once and for all, the twin foes of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, searching questions were asked of the US military. How had this disaster been allowed to happen? Why were US forces on the base so unprepared for the attack? And why had they been so completely taken by surprise? Someone had to carry the can. That man was Husband E. Kimmel, who in 1942 was replaced as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet by Admiral Nimitz and charged with dereliction of duty. Kimmel retired in the same year and was eventually cleared of the charge by a congressional inquiry set up in 1946 to investigate the disaster at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant General Walter Short also lost his job. dismissed by those in high command who were also culpable, but were no doubt anxious to ensure that no blame attached itself to them. The main Japanese players in the story of Pearl Harbor experienced mixed fortunes throughout the remainder of the war. Mitsuo Fushida survived the war despite illness and serious wounds sustained at Midway. Converted to Christianity, Fushida traveled widely in America and Canada after the war, and in a final irony, became a US citizen in 1966. He died there in 1976. Aichi Nagumo was shattered by the loss of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway, and was subsequently transferred to the command of a small naval flotilla in the Marianas. He committed suicide after organizing the Japanese defense of Saipan in July 1944. The greatest loss to Japan was that of Isoroko Yamamoto, who was shot down and killed during an inspection tour of the Solomons in April 1943. Despite the dramatic downturn in Japan's fortunes and his own increasing pessimism as to the eventual outcome of the war, Yamamoto had retained the respect of his superiors and the Japan rank and file. His death came as a severe and untimely blow to the Japanese cause. President Roosevelt's day of infamy, the greatest naval defeat suffered by a major power since Trafalgar in 1805, was eventually avenged with interest.
Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The world has not forgotten that catastrophic day in December 1941, when the war came to America and America came into the war.